Friends, it's a great deal of fear and trepidation. I stand before you at this moment and begin to speak to you at this moment in our service when the Rabbi is supposed to bring some message of hope, of inspiration that will help carry you not merely through the day, but through the year to come. It isn't a trepidation that stems from appearing before a vast congregation, because this morning I'm going to do something I haven't done in 34 years as student and rabbi. I feel a sense of trepidation because for the first time in all my years as student and rabbi, I stand before a high holiday congregation unprepared.
This is the beginning of Rabbi Milton Grafman's Rosh Hashanah sermon at Temple Emmanuel in Birmingham, Alabama on September 19th, 1963. Reeling from the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church just 4 days earlier, and having expressed ambivalence about the tactics of the Birmingham Campaign in the spring and summer of 1963, Rabbi Grafman delivered an off-the-cuff sermon that both defended his damaged reputation and called on white moderates to step up to fight for black civil rights. Welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. My name is Nora Katz. Let's dive in.
Very frankly, this has been a horrible summer. This has been a horrible year. These are troublous times. Very frankly, I hardly knew that Rosh Hashanah was about to begin tomorrow night. There's been no time for thinking and preparation and outline. There was no opportunity to make certain that I would stay within the respectable 20 minutes. There are things that are upon my heart that I want to say to you. It's a calculated risk what I'm doing today, because I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know how you're going to receive it. But there are certain things that have to be said, and I'm going to say them. It will not be the first time that I took a calculated risk.
Let's back up for a second. What is going on in Birmingham as Rabbi Grafman is delivering this sermon? To get a more complete understanding of this moment, I talked to Barry McNeely, education program consultant at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
It's going to start back in the 1940s with housing discrimination. In Birmingham, Alabama, the railroad and the steel industry brought a great deal of people into this area, and so many people came in fact, that they said that the city grew up overnight like magic, and that's where the city gets its nickname. But as people moved in, the idea of intolerance also existed during that time period, and ultimately, Birmingham, Alabama is going to provide 11% of its residential territory to people of color to live in. And when we talk about 11%, we have to understand that people of color in Birmingham made up 43% of the population. And when people tried to move into areas that were previously reserved for white occupancy, you're going to have the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia, the White Citizens Council, and these groups are going to push back. And that pushback included a decided amount of violence. There were people's homes were bombed, and this resistance is going to push people like Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Arthur Shores to the forefront. And Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth is going to develop a relationship with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King very early on. In fact, Shuttlesworth is going to form a civil rights organization in Birmingham, because the state of Alabama is going to outlaw basically the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People within its borders. Fred Shuttlesworth is going to create the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights to take the place of the NAACP. And that would be June of 1956. Well, the next year, in the winter of 1957, and in February of 57, Dr. Martin Luther King is going to call on Fred Shuttlesworth to help him and Bayard Rustin and Ralph Abernathy to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Fred Shuttlesworth, during that period, is going to invite Dr. King to come to Birmingham and take part in the demonstrations that were already in place. And Dr. King agrees, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights are going to begin something known as Project X in the beginning of 1963. I think it's important to mention that in the beginning of 1963 as well, George Wallace is going to be inaugurated governor, and he's going to go down in history with this segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever statement, sort of drawing a line in the sand as to what's going to happen in terms of civil rights in the South, in particular in the state of Alabama. As the movement grows in Birmingham, and a lot of this movement is going to be economic in terms of sit-ins and selective buying. Well, as that movement grows, the Commissioner of Public Safety, who is now actually trying to become the mayor of Birmingham, Bull Connor. Bull Connor is going to use police attack dogs against demonstrators in the Palm Sunday March. And when he does that, the leaders of the movement now realize that they need to make the entire world know what's going on in Birmingham. And they changed their project from Project X to Project C. And Project C stood for confrontation. And at this point, they decided that they were going to confront legalized segregation in every way that they possibly could. And they were going to have, targets where they were going to target City Hall. They were going to target the segregated library. And they were going to target the merchants downtown, which they actually been targeting since 1961. But they were going to make these targets. And as they did, the movement began to make national headlines. And so that's kind of where we are in the spring of 1963.
What ensues in 1963 is what's known as the Birmingham Campaign, a series of targeted protests, boycotts, and other actions that seek to upend the racist status quo. Desegregating downtown department stores, seeking justice for Black people murdered by white supremacists, and bringing national attention to the violence of systemic and institutionalized racism. But Rabbi Grafman isn't just delivering this sermon in a city that has been torn apart by racial violence. He's delivering this sermon in a deeply segregated city, where most members of the white population, including his fellow Jews, are disconnected from the struggles of Birmingham's African-American community. I had the opportunity to speak with 3 members of the Birmingham Jewish community who have vivid memories of Rabbi Grafman's tenure, as well as life in Birmingham during the classical civil rights movement. Robert Levin, David Aarons, and Hal Abrams shared stories of young adulthood in a city in turmoil. We'll also meet Stephen Grafman, Rabbi Grafman's son, who is in many ways the keeper of his father's legacy.
Most of the Jewish families, when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s here in Birmingham, lived over the mountain, as we say, from downtown Birmingham, in a separate community.
Many of us lived in the suburbs, so we were not directly, as far as our school or our grocery stores or our intermediate shopping, we were not confronted with the marches and we lived in a segregated suburb of Birmingham, most of us. So we were, you might say, a step away from the demonstrations and what went on in downtown.
Growing up, it was a totally segregated city. You can't think of anything that wasn't segregated at that time. Certainly the schools were segregated, sports was segregated, you name it.
At that time, one of my dearest friends was Emmanuel, who was running Parisian stores. I later became one of the principals of that store. He invited me to join him and Donald as his son, where I stayed for 20 years. And when I went to work at Parisian, the restrooms were segregated as well as the water fountains, but not the elevators. So I remember all those things very, very well.
I think the most obvious kind of physical flashpoints are when African-American activists are attempting to desegregate downtown businesses, many of which in a large number of southern cities are owned and operated by Jewish businessmen.
That's Clive Webb, professor of modern American history at the University of Sussex and author of Fight Against Fear, Southern Jews and Black Civil Rights. He literally wrote the book on this history, and he's going to help us unpack this story and put it in context.
And that becomes a source of conflict because, when they're trying to engage in either economic boycotts or sit-ins of those businesses, then Jewish businessmen are extremely anxious about what the impact will be in terms of how the white community will react should they open their doors to African-American customers on an equal and open basis. It's less about confrontation than it is about the fact that, so it's not about the two communities sort of moving together or moving towards one another into a conflicting situation, as much as it is about the withdrawal of Jews from the contentious debates and demonstrations and conflicts over civil rights reform. And it's about that really where so it's about their non-participation rather than what they're not doing, rather than what they are doing, that becomes the source of conflict and contention.
And once these problems with the bombing occurred and there were boycotts of some of the businesses that our parents owned, we were advised to just not attend movies downtown, to stay home or go home after services. So just because people were nervous, and so we lived our lives. To me, it could have been in any city. Our lives weren't involved in that as 15-year-olds, as teenagers. We weren't involved in protests. We weren't involved in being involved in the civil rights movement. We were really sort of, I guess, sheltered from what was going on.
By and large, most of my friends and my family were certainly liberals and certainly wanted to see the change and certainly wanted to see the department stores integrated and the restaurants integrated and such like that. But it was just really a question of degree.
Remember, it was 1963. It really wasn't that long after World War II. And I think Jews in this community were probably just trying to make a living, to figure out what their place was in the world, and then maybe they weren't making so much noise, and just trying to get along and survive. Not saying that they didn't know the difference between right and wrong, but I think it was I would say it was a challenging time. It'd be much different today in how we would have expressed ourselves, I would say.
The South is less, how can I put it? It remains more insular than the rest of the United States. Racism is still entrenched and institutionalized and enforced at times by extra-legal violence. And Jews are much smaller in number in the South than they are in the North. they tend to cluster in larger urban centers, you know, for obvious reasons that's where employment opportunities are, where there's strength in numbers, where there tends to be, you know, at least in some cities like Atlanta or, you know, or a city of that ilk, a slightly more progressive civic spirit and a greater fluidity to race relations. But you know, but on the whole, the South is you know, it's you know, it is a much more reactionary political climate, and it's one where it's probably more dangerous to be Jewish than it is elsewhere. There's a strain of anti-Semitism that runs through Southern history, you know, and it remains dormant at times, but it tends to kind of, in moments of crisis and dislocation, it comes back to the surface.
I think that the Jewish population, for the most part, just wanted to duck out and not get harmed. I really believe the Jewish community felt that they were in danger. And I think we have some proof of that.
I don't think it's like just fear, and I don't actually like leaning into that narrative too much. I think that that's a narrative that sort of dominated historical accounting at that time, but definitely a sense of sort of staying out of things. And that wasn't unusual for the white community in Birmingham generally.
That's Margaret Norman, Director of Programming and Engagement at Temple Beth-El, Birmingham's conservative synagogue. Margaret is leading the development of the Beth-El civil rights experience.
Like, white Birmingham at that time is, you know, in many ways sort of disengaged from the movement, from what I can see. You know, there's a lack of like local media attention, and there's like a real separation between people in the city. I think people don't feel like personally involved in many ways until they are, you know, with the merchants and things like that, which sort of bring this maybe a little bit more to the forefront.
I'm just as sick as hard as you are about what's happened in our city. I've been sick about it for years. Anybody with a shred of humanity in him could not have been but horrified what happened Saturday or Sunday. But I'm sick at heart for a lot of other reasons. I'm sick at heart because of the attitude not of the people who either by direction or indirection were responsible for the death of those children. Not for the people who by direction or indirection are responsible for the horrible image that this city of ours has throughout the country and this Jewish community has throughout the country. But I'm sick at heart because of what the so-called nice people, not only in the city of Birmingham, but in Temple Emmanuel, the liberals in Temple Emmanuel, the people that sneer at everything that happens in this city, who point the finger at everyone beginning with a rabbi, who want to put the blame upon everyone but themselves. Sick at heart. Their attitude also. I'm sick and tired of finger pointing. I'm weary of reasons and rationalizations. And I'm weary of people congregating in their homes and their places of business over their coffee, wherever they may be. I'm weary of people calling me on the telephone and asking me, what are you doing? What's the temple doing? What's the Jewish community doing? I'm tired of liberals and reactionaries coming into my study, wanting to know what's going on. If I had the time, I might try to tell you what your rabbi's been doing. I answer to my conscience. You'll have to answer to yours.
In his sermon, Rabbi Grafman castigates members of the Jewish community who have failed to stand up for justice and equality. Of course, many Jews, including Grafman, privately expressed sympathy for the civil rights cause. Looking back on 1963, less than 2 decades after the end of World War II, it's easy to see why.
Well, you can't understand the Jewish response to the civil rights movement without reference to the Holocaust. And, Jews, there's no more singular moment in history to impose on Jews their own precarious status in, anywhere in the world, really, and to sensitize them to the plight of other oppressed peoples. So I think that there is an innate sense of both sympathy and empathy towards African Americans and part of many Jews, who it's both intrinsic in the sense that they believe that racial equality is in itself an important goal to strive for, but it's also something that they understand will benefit themselves, that a society that is tolerant towards all minorities, racial, religious, ethnic, will inevitably be of benefit to them. So that in other words, that the advancement of African Americans' cause for equality will be of benefit to Jews, because it will help to create a more liberal, open, and progressive society.
There is a moral obligation coming directly out of Holocaust memory. But it's not like Judaism as a religion dictating a responsibility, but a sense that, when we needed the general population to act, they didn't. And so now we have a responsibility to do better. And so I think that's definitely a sentiment that I've seen.
In 1938, he was then the rabbi of Temple Hadith Israel in Lexington, Kentucky, which was his first congregation. He participated in a summer seminar for 3 months, where they visited all of the, not all, but many of the Eastern European countries. And among the ones that he went to was Nazi Germany. He saw what was going on. He saw the beginning of the destruction of European Jewry, and it had an effect on him for the rest of his life. He never forgot that. He explains even then that that's 25, 30 years later, the impact that some of the things he saw in Nazi Germany, he analogized it to what he was seeing in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And you can't talk about this man without factoring in that experience in 1938. It was a lifelong experience.
I resent liberals who are liberals for political reasons. I resent liberals who have political aspirations, who have something economic to gain, just as I resent reactionaries and conservatives for the same reason. All this, I said, I haven't thought out what I was going to say yet. It's a lonely road I travel because, you see, as a rabbi, no matter how close you may think you are to me, in the final analysis, I'm still an outsider. Rabbis come and rabbis go. Blood is thicker than water. Business partners and men who have business relationship, much thicker than the relationship with the rabbi. It's a lonely road that you travel. And I travel a lonely road in this whole racial situation. I travel a lonely road because I want justice and I want equality for the Negro. But I also want fairness and equality and decency for the white man. I want this problem to be worked out not on the basis of politics. I want it not to be worked out on the basis of who can shout the louder to get the votes.
This is confusing, right? Grafman is calling for civil rights without politics, which we know isn't possible. Civil rights organizing is inherently political. He also seems to be saying that people engaged in biracial organizing and segregationists are equally driven by selfish means, which also isn't the case. This moment in the sermon, when we can start to really hear Grafman outlining his own politics, is the perfect time to talk about Southern Jewish responses to the civil rights movement. And when we talk about responses in this story, we're often talking about the lack thereof.
This is not just a project about people who did things. This is a project about people who did things and people who didn't do things, because you can't understand one without the other. And that's the whole story.
If we stood up too loud and too long, it could affect our businesses, and it could affect our families. And all of us were young people, but we had parents, and our parents, many of them were fearful of taking that extra mile only because they supported maybe the work of the civil rights movement. And there were many members of our congregation that were active, some of them, but nobody really went out on the streets and marched with the marchers because that just wasn't done. Why were we quiet? Why didn't we not write letters to the editor? We could spew liberal thoughts and say that's all good, but that's easy to do if you're in a suburb of Birmingham and you're not on the front line, and you could go to work and go to school and not fear and not have any pain.
The Jews were those that had places of business. I think they were very quiet about what needed to be done. I don't think the Jewish population, the Jewish people, were involved with trying to make changes.
Concern about one's welfare can be an excuse for not taking action, rather than necessarily a cause for it. So there are undoubtedly some Jews who, having grown up in a Jim Crow society, have become acculturated to it and accept that division between the races as the norm. So it's not simply they don't believe that they can change it; they don't want to change it. Now those Jews tend to be certainly of an older generation, perhaps living in the deeper parts of the South. There are unquestionably some, there's unquestionably a reactionary element amongst Southern Jews that doesn't want change. I think that they tend to be a minority, and self-preservation is really the principal reason why some Jews choose not to become involved, and with good reason. There's an organized terrorist campaign in the South in the late 1950s that sees the attempted or actual bombing of a number of synagogues. There's a very serious anti-Semitic strain to a lot of segregationist propaganda. The claim that the Jews are the secret masterminds behind the civil rights movement, because if you believe in notions of white superiority and black inferiority, then how can African Americans possibly be, themselves organizing a mass movement of rebellion against white supremacy? There has to be another explanation, and that leads to these anti-Semitic accounts for how the movement has come into being. So it's a genuinely scary, dangerous environment. And I think looking back on things, it's easy for us to be very judgmental about people and to say, well, I would have definitely stood up and done something. But we all as human beings have our frailties and a desire to kind of protect yourself and your family and your community. It's understandable, even if it's not something that you might necessarily, one wouldn't condone it, but one can at least appreciate why some Jews felt paralyzed and unable to take more public action.
Rabbi Grafman, I think, could almost be a case study in some of the primary dynamics that we're focusing on in the Bethel civil rights experience. This the sort of push and pull between wanting to do the right thing and moderation. Definitely the dynamics between, again, wanting to be on the right side of history, but also, wanting to protect the Jewish community and having some fear about participating.
Rabbi Grafman was a gradualist, and I would say that many members of the congregation went along with him. There were all ranges of spectrum of liberals and conservatives in our congregation, and many moderates also. But a lot of people went along with Rabbi Grafman's feeling that let's take time. We don't need to riot. We don't need to do that. He certainly was not a liberal. He certainly was not an arch conservative, but he just thought change should take place gradual and not on the streets and not protesting, things like that. And he certainly didn't think that anybody from the outside should come and tell the citizens of Birmingham what to do and how to behave.
I think that on an abstract level, Milton Grafman understood the moral imperative of civil rights reform. He's not somebody who's grown up in the South and is fully acculturated to its ways. But Birmingham, Alabama is a brutally repressive society. Birmingham, as it was nicknamed. This is one of the most repressive cities in the American South, one where not only do domestic terrorists have, maneuver to conduct, a lethal campaign against African Americans, but where the police force are also, an instrument of brutal white supremacism. In that climate, Grafman believes that he has got little or no choice but to maintain his, what he would see as a diplomatic silence. He's not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. He's at best someone, he's a moderate, somebody who, is compelled as much by external circumstance as by inner conviction to take action. He's late to the cause. He does so when, I think, it's not as though Milton Grafman is the only person who stands up in revulsion at what's happened with the 16th Street bombing. He's swept up by that broader, turning of the tide that's taking place.
In positioning Grafman in this story, I think it's really relevant to understand that he was adored by his congregation.
He was the focal point of the Jewish community in Birmingham. He was totally dedicated to our congregation. He was old school. That was what he did. He loved being a rabbi.
What I'm trying to say to you, friends, is this: that regardless of what you read on television, see on television, regardless of what you read in the paper, even the Attorney General this morning, I heard him on television, indicated that there was at least some little reservoir of goodwill here. There was an effort being made. And I tell you all this by way of saying that for days there have been about 20 of us that have been meeting, colored and white. And since this terrible thing happened, and I pleaded with them particularly, I said to them, if Birmingham has anything to repent of, to atone for, let it be the white community of Birmingham that makes the atonement. Let us not have fundraising throughout the country to rebuild that church, to pay for the funeral expenses. You can't repay these people for the loss of their children, but whatever we can do to help them. Hospital expenses. But let us do it. Let the white people of Birmingham do it.
What does Rabbi Grafman want to atone for? The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, a horrendous act of terror that shook the city of Birmingham on the morning of September 15th, 1963.
On the morning of September 15th, dynamite goes off next to the 16th Street Baptist Church, and takes the lives of, Carol Denise McNair and Cynthia Wesley Morris and Addie Mae Collins and, excuse me, Carol Roberson, and grievously injures 12-year-old Sarah Collins. This is going to literally shake the foundation of the city of Birmingham. That blast is going to be felt as far away as Red Mountain. The club restaurant that sits on top of Red Mountain, the workers there, they testified that the plates vibrated violently on the shelves that morning. But it literally shook Birmingham, but it figuratively shook the nation and the world.
It's just unfathomable that people could be that hate-oriented to do something like that. But there were a whole bunch of them that could and did.
That awful Sunday in 1963, I was coming back from Dermot, Arkansas, after spending the weekend with my parents. And in those years, I didn't get radio contact coming back until I got to Tuscaloosa. It was already dark, and when I could pick up the news, and when I heard what had happened that morning in 1963, I had to stop the car and on the side of the road and just I was absolutely frozen. And it was 15 or 20 minutes before I could get back on the road to come on home. But it was a tragedy that I just could not believe.
Birmingham, going forward from September the 15th, 1963, Dr. King said that sunlight was the greatest disinfectant. And the gaze of the world was turned on to Birmingham.
I do think that the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was a huge turning point for white Birmingham generally.
In a way, the bombing was a turning point for Rabbi Grafman, too.
I believe it made him realize that there was a lot more that needed to be done by the Jewish community, and it had not been done. And I think he said so in his speech.
Grafman was relatively late, in the sense it's the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church that forces his hand. That it can pay. I think he's atoning to some extent for what he understands is his failure until that point to be on the right side of history. It's impossible for him to maintain any more silence, and for his congregation to do so. Where do you draw the line? And this is his red line, I think.
So now it's the morning of September 19th, and the congregation of Temple Emmanuel is sitting down for Rosh Hashanah services.
Going to services on Rosh Hashanah in 1963, we pull up to Temple, and usually there's no security at the time, maybe just an extra parking attendant for the holidays. But we get to Temple, and you could see the place was crowded with policemen. And obviously there was also what we determined some plain clothes, maybe FBI. You could just feel the tension in the air that morning. It was thick. And I will tell you one thing, in the middle of services, I vividly remember this. I remember a helicopter whirling over the sanctuary, over the top of the temple, over the dome. And that was a very, very tense moment, and a very, very, a moment that just sticks in my memory.
I'm talking about those of you particularly keep talking about what ought to be done. What have you done? You know how the image of this city is created? It isn't created by Wallace, and it isn't created by Connor and by Haynes. It's created by those letters to the editor in the newspaper. I want to know how many Jews sitting in this room have written a letter to the editor of the Birmingham Post Herald or the News What's the matter? Haven't you got the guts to do it? You're afraid you might have harassing calls? I've had them since 1955. Because I referred to the governor 2 months ago as bellicose and signed a statement to the effect that everyone, including him, has to obey laws until they're changed and court decisions until they're reversed. My life was actually threatened, though no one knew about it. And for 2.5 months, my home under surveillance. It's a calculated risk. It's a calculated risk what I'm saying from this pulpit right now. Every measure of security has been taken for your safety. Every measure. And at great cost, incidentally, financially. And at sacrifice on the part of many of our own members. But stop being liberals in your parlors and in your offices. I know of only 2 men in this community. One's a member of my congregation sitting in here right now. And the other is not a member of my congregation. And if you don't like the word guts from the pulpit, it's the only word that can be used. Who have had the guts to challenge Connor and Wallace and segregation and the whole problem of integration and everything else. I'm not going to mention any names. But you know about whom I'm talking, and you know that I'm telling the truth. I'm here to say that if you want to change this, you're going to have to start standing up and being counted. It's a calculated risk. Are you willing to take the risk? Are you willing to be harassed? Are you willing to be threatened? I was once criticized for using this expression, and maybe it has no place in the pulpit, but I'm talking to you from the heart, and I told you I didn't prepare. You're either going to have to put up or you're going to have to shut up. You're either going to have to put up or you're going to have to stop talking and acting like liberals. You're going to have to stop being horrified at what happens. We're only 3,900 men, Jewish men, women, and children. I'm conscious of this fact. I'm not asking you to go out and lead a crusade, but in heaven's sake, can't you do at least what I've done is join with other Christians? I admit that I wouldn't have signed my name to these statements alone, but with Bishop Murray and Bishop Durrick and with Bishop Carpenter and Bishop Harmon, I felt that I was protecting you, and there was a measure of security for myself. And you've got to talk to your Christian friends. This is the first thing.
Grafman is talking about the actions he took over the past several months here with a candor that he hadn't shown before. The fact that Rabbi Grafman was speaking off the cuff was unprecedented.
His sermon that day, I have marveled at this over the years, this was extemporaneous. And he just let it all out, okay? And he was mad, he was angry.
He spoke off the cuff. He rambled a lot. That wasn't his style. He was, I remember his notes. He always had typed notes, usually outline form, right next to his book. Everything was just so. I think this was an overwhelming experience for him. I can't imagine. It was 4 days after those little girls were killed. He was unafraid. He was not afraid of what the ramifications of what he was saying were. He was not his usual controlled self.
In many moments, he was almost shouting this sermon. And I can remember it would be sending chills down your spine. And he challenged us.
I really don't think that, I'm obviously no authority on this, but I really don't think that there are many rabbis, ministers, that would say what he said, say it with the compassion he said it, excoriate your congregation in the process and have them coming out praising you for what he did, which is one of the congregants I saw one of the letters said, response to his sermon said, you really gave us a real kick in the pants, a direct quote. You gave us a kick in the pants that we deserved.
while he was no liberal and he castigated people on both sides, but basically that morning, Rabbi Grafman excoriated us to not just sit up there in our homes and cluck our heels and say, ta-ta-ta, do something about it. Write letters to the editors. Stand up and be counted. There weren't many members of our congregation at the time that were really willing to stand up and be counted and be forceful of it because people had a natural fear of their way of life.
The more he talked, the more inspired I became about being involved.
The next thing I want to say is this. Let's stop talking about being liberals if we don't mean it. Where were you yesterday afternoon at 3:30? I'll tell you where I was. I was the 6th Avenue Baptist Church, Negro. I was at that funeral. I'm no hero. Anybody knows me, I'm no hero, I'm no martyr. I don't want to get killed. I don't want to have this temple bombed, and I don't want my home bombed. And I don't want to be knocked off gangster style. I was warned by a law enforcement official not to go there. I was told, and several of us knew, that it was a calculated risk that this thing could be turned into a political orgy instead of a funeral. We didn't want to go to be on television. We didn't want to make heroes of ourselves. 4 children had been brutally killed. All we wanted to do was to go there and express our grief and our sorrow, to show these Negro families that we felt the depth of their sorrow, we shared it. All we wanted to do was to say to the Negro community, you're not alone. There are white people. This was all.
It's both a kind of, an exhortation to others to stand up. But it's also an apologia, where he realizes that he himself has been at fault, and he, in doing so, has helped, unwittingly perhaps, to foster the climate in which white terrorists believe that it is okay, it's possible for them to conduct a crime of the likes of the 16th Street bombing.
He really called our congregation to action, and he called us to the carpet, and he blistered us. He blistered us for our silence. He blistered us for proclaiming our liberalism, but not doing anything about it. And that is something, his speech says, this was horrible and it's inexcusable. And he blasted us.
He was interviewed about 30 years later. When asked about this, he said, I excoriated, his word, not mine, I excoriated the congregation for their failure to do more.
And he spoke very bluntly about what the Jewish community had not done.
He's clearly moved by what's happened at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and he is calling on his congregation to do more. And I do think, the people who were involved, who were really out there doing things, they were few and far between, in the Jewish community and in the white community here in Birmingham, just generally. So I think that he's definitely calling on them, and I think he is defending himself. My sense is that he was deeply affected by a letter from a Birmingham jail.
Let's get to a core part of this story, Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. I'll let Rabbi Grafman set up his position before we dive in.
I'm sick about making a Roman circus out of every episode that happens, of whipping up hatred throughout the country when we're trying to whip up love in this country, and we need your help. May I say that I have over here, if I had the time, I would like to read, which I'm not going to take, letters that I've received from out the country. These are for people who read Martin Luther King from a Birmingham letter from a Birmingham jail. It's an answer to myself and 8 other clergymen. A beautiful literary document, but a vicious one. He did us an injustice. The things that hurt us, that when an organization like the Anti-Defamation League, that's supposed to be devoted to protecting Jews, publishes this thing, and lets a rabbi be damned throughout the world. This is something else that kind of makes you sick.
Rabbi Grafman is saying a lot here, so let's back up. In January of 1963, following the election of segregationist Governor George Wallace, Rabbi Grafman was one of several signatories to an open letter to the white community of Alabama calling for patience while civil rights issues were litigated and addressed in court.
They specifically stated, and that this is a direct quote, that every human being is created in the image of God and is entitled to respect as a fellow human being with all basic rights, privileges, and responsibilities which belong to mankind.
In April of 1963, Rabbi Grafman signed another letter, joined by 7 white clergy members in Birmingham. The letter describes the protests in Birmingham as, quote, extreme measures, arguing that while they are technically peaceful, they were inciting hatred and violence. The letter called on the Black community to withdraw their support from these demonstrations. It was a total rejection of what Dr. King, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and so many others were fighting for.
In the Black community, there's this saying that don't start none, won't be none. And there were a lot of pent up disappointments that the movement had with the clergy. As we sit here in 2021, decades removed from this time period, still 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the United States of America. And that's in 2021, not 1963. And so as Dr. King sees this letter and reads this letter, he seizes upon the idea to vent his frustrations with those people who were, by the virtue of the fact, there was a quote that Dr. King once said, and it was during the Montgomery bus boycott, and it's on the walls in the permanent exhibition of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. But that quote says, if we are wrong, then the Supreme Court is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And so he reaches with the letter from Birmingham jail to respond to the 8 clergymen on several different levels.
I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people.
letter from Birmingham jail sends shockwaves across the country. It's published by major news outlets, and it continues to be read in school classrooms around the world. And Grafman is vilified by many people, including many members of the Jewish community. Some folks who knew Grafman feel that this is unfair, that it's a misinterpretation of their understanding of his intentions when he signed that letter.
Because of the letter and Rabbi Grafman being a part of the people who signed the letter, I think there's been misinterpretation of his thoughts on civil rights, integration, and how he felt about the civil rights movement. I feel like I understand the type of person he was. And I think because of that letter, there's been an unfair judgment of him.
Rabbi Grafman, who certainly came in for an awful lot of criticism, I believe a lot of unfair criticism, it'd be hard to categorize him as a bigot, particularly if you read what he did throughout his lifetime.
In the public archives here, there are some, within his files, some pieces of correspondence of him responding to people, years after that, who would still send him letters, sort of vilifying him. And I think he was very defensive of that.
You can hear that defensiveness in this sermon. The idea of this moment as a turning point for Grafman becomes increasingly muddied here. At the point in which he's giving this passionate, extemporaneous sermon, Grafman has clearly decided that he needs to speak publicly about the injustices he's observed in Birmingham. But he also remains firm in his belief that direct action by African Americans is not an acceptable response to that injustice. We're about to hear Rabbi Grafman calling the congregation to action, not to take to the streets, but rather to contribute to the reward fund that's being set up to help catch the people who perpetrated the bombing.
Now, there's one thing you can do, and I'm a little disappointed. I don't know whether it'll work or not. Let's put up the money, because these people have got to be caught. We know from whom we think we know from whom this stems. And let me say, these people are primarily anti-Semitic, and this is where you've got a stake. Because let me tell you, if they get away with this, nobody's going to be safe, and the first ones that will not be safe will be the members of the Jewish community. Now, the next thing, and you lagged, by the way, behind on that, I can tell you. The next thing, let me say, week after week I had car. Got them back there. You want to pick them up when you go out. Sign them and send them into Reward City Hall if you're willing to help underwrite this reward fund. We want Birmingham to make atonement. And we're trying to see that people don't go off in 50 different directions. There's been a fund set up, 15th Street Baptist Memorial Fund. I'll tell you what I'd like to see you do. One of the Negro ministers, President of Daniel Payne College, said no. He said, let's not put anybody on the spot. He said, even the money isn't important. I would rather have less money but more people. I would rather that we could say 100,000 people in the city of Birmingham contributed, 200,000 contributed. $1 apiece rather than say that 50 men contributed $200,000, and I had to agree with him because I think this is part of the purging process. And what I'd like you to do is this. I'd like really not to put you on the spot, but I'd like to be able to feel what my congregation is going to do. We're going to find out how much it's going to cost to rebuild that church, and we're going to rebuild it better than it was. But we don't want to do it with money from Chicago and New York and San Francisco. White money from Birmingham, Christian, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish money. And may I suggest to you that you think this over, write a generous check to the 16th Street Baptist Fund, Memorial Fund. You can send it to me. I'd like to be able to say that every member of my congregation, I'm not interested in your amount. I won't even look at the amount. I just want to be able to know that there were this many people from Temple Emmanuel that made a contribution. I'll see that it's turned over to the First National Bank or to the Birmingham Trust National Bank. And there's a Jew in this congregation, a Jew in this community, whose heart does not move him, if for no other reason than sympathy, let alone to try to rectify an injustice, then I feel that this whole service has been in vain.
The response was overwhelmingly favorable. He had a file, which I have now, which is, he collected, as I said, he kept everything, of maybe 30 or 40 letters from people in the congregation thanking him for writing that. One of the memorable ones that was from a young, 10, 12-year-old in the Sunday school who was there. And she said, I really appreciate what you said. It needed to be said. And I'm enclosing my $5 contribution because I want it to go to the fund that's been created.
I mean, it was a call to arms. And I think it made a profound change. I know it made a profound change in me. It stirred up our community in ways that it needed to be done. And he took that leadership.
So I think this sermon is such a great piece to focus on in understanding Birmingham's history, particularly as pertains to the Jewish community and civil rights. You can pull so much from that. All of these dynamics that really define, I think, this history are there in that sermon.
This isn't the way I like to talk in Rosh Hashanah. I told you, I've never done this before. These are terrible times. And it's time to stand up and be counted. It's time to do things. It's time to pay the price, whether it's in personal safety and security or whether it's in money. And the question is, are you ready to pay the price? Because if you're not, God help this city. This city isn't dead yet. Not by a long shot. It's almost dead. You and decent Christians in this community can revive this city. Once we get to understand each other, this is going to be the greatest area in the country. You've got a stake and a share in that area in this city. You can make it possible. Please forgive me for having spoken to you maybe in a rambling manner, maybe in an illogical manner, too long, but I warned you when I started. I was unprepared. I simply wanted to talk to you what was on my heart. And the Talmud says that words that leave the heart enter the heart. I hope that the words that have come from my heart have entered yours. And I hope that the prayers of our magnificent liturgy, which tell the same story, and which came from the heart of our great sages and seers over the centuries, have entered yours. And I know that you join me in the prayer. Perhaps this Rosh Hashanah will usher in a new era and a new day for us, for our city, our state, our country, and for all mankind. Amen.
Rabbi Grafman's legacy in Birmingham, he was a giant in Birmingham.
And he left his mark on so many people. It's interesting, in our community alone, we're still talking about it.
His legacy is very much a strong, favorable one. It's present to this day in Temple Emmanuel.
It's important that when we look back at this history, at these stories of activism and passivity, of empathy and apathy, that we understand that all of these individuals, including Rabbi Grafman, were real, whole, complicated people. And it's important that we shine a light on these stories, even and especially when they make us uncomfortable.
It's important that, certainly in the context of Southern Jews, to not be deluded about the fact that while there were honorable exceptions, there were many Jews who didn't or couldn't stand up and be counted at the time, and that had an impact.
I think in hindsight, we know that those demonstrations were really important in 1963. Like, looking back, we know that that was a tipping point, not just in Birmingham, but also just in drawing the nation's eyes and even like the world's eyes to the things that were happening, here in Birmingham and here in the South. So it's a huge moment in terms of receiving national attention for the civil rights movement. And that's important too, although I think at the time that was part of what people were definitely worried about.
Given all of that, Rabbi Milton Grafman is a complicated figure. He wasn't a civil rights activist, nor was he a segregationist. Public memory of Rabbi Grafman paints him as a progressive leader, when in reality he had deep misgivings about the tactics and aims of the civil rights movement and expressed them publicly. Even as we talk about the way Rabbi Grafman called his congregation to action in this incredible sermon, I don't want us to forget the important context surrounding it.
It's not a kind of, there's not a grand conversion narrative here in which somebody who either has kind of buried as in a liberal or has not been a liberal is suddenly converted wholesale to the cause. I don't think he was ever that. I think he was somebody who always operated within very narrow parameters. He's a much more cautious and conservative figure than many other rabbis in the South.
So beyond Grafman and beyond the Jewish community, what is the legacy of the Birmingham Campaign?
So as we move out of Birmingham 63, I think that the clergy itself saw itself being larger than the Sabbath and larger than Shabbat. And they were going to have to take what they preached and actually take it to the streets. And I think that it actually helped them to become what they were supposed to be all the time. And I think that would be something that we could look back on this time period and take pride in. We're still here in 2021, and there's still things that need to be done. And just like Fred Shuttlesworth kept that work moving forward, you still have people of goodwill that are trying to move forward. And so many different movements have joined into this, I guess, march towards a more perfect union due to what happened in 1963. And I would say that would be the legacy of that year.
There's one more part of this story that I want to share with you. But first, I need to thank the folks who helped produce this episode of the ISJL Virtual Vacation. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Special thanks to the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, Ohio, Stephen Grafman, and Dana Herman for allowing us to use the recording of Rabbi Grafman's sermon for this episode. Thanks also to Rabbi Matt Dreffin and Dr. Josh Parshall for their assistance with transliteration on this episode. You can learn more about the ISJL Virtual Vacation, sign up for updates, and watch all of our past episodes on our website, isjl.org/virtual vacation. And now for the last part of this story. On Tuesday, September 18th, 1963, Rabbi Milton Grafman attended the funeral of 3 of the girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. A few hours later, he led Erev Rosh Hashanah services at Temple Emmanuel.
And that was a very dramatic moment. I remember it, Nora, to this day, and it brings chills to me how Rabbi Grafman would do that and really put our congregation, here we said Kaddish as a community and as a congregation for the 4 young girls that lost their life. That was a very dramatic moment, and it's a moment I will never forget.
Yiskadal, Yiskadash, Shmei Rabbo, Yolma divrocher u sevi am lichmach u sei. Chaya chon of yomai chon of chaya de chon basis roel. Agolovis ban korivim ru amein yeish me rabom aborach. Leolam lo meol mayo. Yisborach v'yishtabach v'yisbowar v'yisromam v'yisnasei. V'yisadar v'yisalef v'yisalal shmei kudishah. Brechu. Elamin kol b'chosov v'shirosov. Tuj b'chosov v'nechem osov damirom b'yolmo. V'yimru amein. Let us bow our heads in silence. Memory of Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, James Robinson, Virgil Ware, brutally murdered, wantonly killed, insanely slain, whose death we mourn, whose families we would comfort, the shame of whose murder we would and we must have our city atone. Memory of all our own loved ones who departed from among us. These departed who we now remember have entered into the peace of life eternal. They still live on earth in the acts of goodness they performed and the hearts of those who cherish their memory. May the beauty of their life abide among us as a loving benediction. Yehi shlomo rabba min shemai v'chayim. Olein of the old kol yisroel v'imru amein, oseh shalom imromov. Hu yaseh shalom olein of the old kol yisroel v'imru amein. May the Father of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort all the bereaved among us. Amen.